Hello, my name is Hallie Keisler, and I'm a psychology and Spanish major here at Presbyterian College. For the past 2 semesters, I've taken part in honors research with Dr. Brandell through the psychology department. Our research examined grit and life satisfaction among college students. I will begin by providing an outline of the presentation. First, we will talk through our background information, expanding on our key variables of grit and life satisfaction. Next, we will discuss the participants, which were Presbyterian College students, followed by our research questions that define what we are examining in our research. Measures will be next, and we will look at the 2 forms of measurements used, which were the triarchic model of grit scale and the Riverside life satisfaction scale. Then we will review our results of our research and conclude with a discussion of the implications, limitations, and future directions. Starting with our key variables in our background, we will first explore grit. Grit is the tendency to sustain interest and effort towards long-term goals. This term and definition was coined in the early 2000s by Angela Duckworth, as she used 2 main factors to structure grit: passion and perseverance. Passion is one's continuous interest in their long-term goals, keeping them working toward their overall goal. Passion has been deemed the compass of one's long-term goals, while perseverance is when one continues to try again in the face of failure. While researching grit, Duckworth and her team did multiple studies on it, 2 being cadets in the U.S. military and participants in the Scripps National Spelling Bee. Grit was found to be a predictor of overall achievement. In doing our background research, we found there to be a few critiques of Duckworth's specific structural model of grit. First, we noticed that Duckworth and her team repeatedly examined the relationship between grit and performance-based or achievement-based variables, but they did not evaluate the relationship of grit with subjective aspects such as life satisfaction or general well-being. With our study, that is what I'm describing today. We wanted to address and help understand the gap in this literature. Secondly, another critique that we found was that there were conceptual limitations to Duckworth's model. And this is in terms of the applicability to populations outside of high achieving groups such as hers that she primarily studied. The third critique was concerns about measurement inconsistencies, and these have really risen in the past couple of years. For examples, some studies have suggested that scores on the passion subscale are not effective in predicting outcome measures, as like the grit total score and the perseverance subscale score. In light of these limitations of Duckworth's specific structural models, we chose a different and revised structural model of grit, which is called the triarchic model of grit. This model was developed by Dato in 2010 and has been evaluated in a program of research involving several studies in the last couple of years. This model adds a third factor in comparison to Duckworth's. The 3 factors moving from top to bottom on the slide are: first, consistency of interest, which refers to one's consistency to stick to a specific set of interests to achieve a long-term aspiration. This corresponds with Duckworth's original conceptualization of the passion subscale. In the middle, we have perseverance of effort, which refers to an individual's inclination to persist in performing challenging tasks, even with potential hurdles of risk or failure that occur along the way. This corresponds with Duckworth's conceptualization of perseverance subscale. Lastly, the additional factor, which is adaptability of situations, refers to the ability to adjust actions based on specific situational or contextual demands. This additional factor brings in the demands of life and how it continuously changes, and us as individuals have to change in response with our actions and our plans. In addition to this variable, life satisfaction was also a key variable in our research. Lang and Schmitz define life satisfaction as a subjectively perceived quality of life based on an individual's preference and life domains. Basically, when we're talking about life satisfaction, we're talking about how an individual has their own perception of their overall quality of life based on their choices that they have made, and how things are going on particular parts of their life, such as home, school, work, and social settings. It is a multidimensional measure, including physical, emotional, and social functioning. The evaluation of life satisfaction aligns well with the themes of today's positive psychology. By emphasizing the importance of living a meaningful and fulfilling life instead of just measuring success based on our tangible achievements. There have been plentiful research looking at the relationship between variables like life satisfaction or well-being with traits and characteristics that are related to grit, such as conscientiousness. But as we noted earlier with Duckworth's research, fewer studies have looked at grit's specific relationship with these components of subjective well-being. Dato and his colleagues have really led the way in building this specific area of research. For example, Dato found significant positive relationships between grit and overall well-being and other positive mental health outcomes. Another study done by Bowman in 2015 has alluded to the connection between grit and life satisfaction, as students in their study were found to have a correlation between their college satisfaction and their grit satisfaction. In Pennings and colleagues, we also see this same connection, as there was another connection of variables to our study, as they found an association between higher levels of grit and lower levels of suicidal ideation for the participants in their study. In terms of our study, our participants consisted of a convenient sample of Presbyterian College undergraduate students and 4 psychology and 2 sophomore year experience courses taught by Dr. Brendel. There were a total of 88 students altogether with a mean age of 20 years old. So now that we have some background information, let's look at our research questions that we have developed. We broke our research questions down into 2 main questions. The first, is there a correlation between age and grit? We believe that the older participants would have more clarity in their interests and long-term goals in comparison to the younger participants, and they would have a higher reported grit score. The younger participants would have less of a sense of who they were and what they wanted long-term. Our second question is there a correlation between grit and life satisfaction scores? When creating this question, we inferred that participants with more grit would have greater life satisfaction due to their ability to adapt, have continuous passion in their desires, and to continue in the face of failure. So we use 3 main measurements in our study. One was the initial demographic survey that we developed, and then 2 were validated questionnaires related to primary study variables. The first being the triarchic model of grit scale, and the second being the Riverside life satisfaction scale. So starting with the demographic survey, this was used to collect age and other demographic variables such as self-reported race and ethnicity, academic year, and options to identify as a transfer student, just to help us understand the characteristics of our sample population for generalizability purposes. The first scale that we used was the triarchic model of grit scale, or the TMGS, which you will hear us refer to it as. This is a 10-item self-report questionnaire. It's on a 5-point Likert scale response, and these go from not at all like me to very much like me. And scoring is on a 1 to 5 range, with 5 being most gritty and 1 being least gritty. The second scale is the Riverside Life Satisfaction Scale, or the RLSS. It is a 6-item self-report questionnaire on a 7-point Likert scale, and responses go from strongly agree to strongly disagree. It is scored on a range from 1 to 7, 7 being extremely satisfied with life, 1 being not at all satisfied with life. Both of these models were used to form our research findings. So now that we have went through all of that, we are going to start with our results. But before we go into a correlational analysis of our research questions, we're going to look at some descriptive data related to what our participants reported. In the chart below, you can see the overall descriptive statistics. And as you can see, there was a different amount of responses for our grit and life satisfaction surveys, as one participant did not complete the RLSS. In terms of the mean, it should be noted that the grit score is on a 1 to 5 scale, and the life satisfaction is on a 1 to 7 scale. In previous research by Duckworth and colleagues with participants ages 20 to 25, an average grit score was recorded to be 3.2. The average grit score of our participants was 0.5 higher than that of Duckworth's. However, we do want to point out that her scale was on a 2-factor model, whereas ours was on a 3-factor model. In terms of life satisfaction, a past study of Datto using participants outside of the U.S. had an average life satisfaction score of 5.02, which is 0.6 higher than that of our average participant score. Now, we are going to break down our results by research question to evaluate the correlation between variables. So, our first research question was, is there a correlation between age and grit scores? We found no significant relationship between the two variables of age and grit scores. And as you can see in the graph, the points are dispersed evenly across age. In terms of our second research question of, is there a correlation between grit and life satisfaction? We did find a statistically significant positive correlation between grit and life satisfaction scores, with a correlation coefficient of 0.343. This was significant at the 0.001 level. Now, remember earlier when we were talking about the triarctic model of grit, there were 3 subscales pertaining to those 3 factors of consistency of interest, perseverance of effort, and adaptability of situations. For these subscales, we broke them down a bit more so that you can see them on the chart and see their correlation with life satisfaction. We did find a statistically significant association between 2 of our TMGS subscales and our RLSS scores. The 2 subscales that were significantly correlated with RLSS scores were consistency of interest and adaptability to situations. The correlation coefficients and significant levels for these 2 relationships can be observed on the first and third row, and those are the ones in bold. As for perseverance of effort, there was not found to be a significant association with life satisfaction, and that is in that middle row. So now we are going to move into our discussion where we're going to look at limitations and interpretations and our final addition to research. With multiple study results like Duckworth and Datto's lining up with our results, we find that our study does align with past and current research occurring on grit and life satisfaction. One example is the relative closeness of our significance of relationships found between grit and life satisfaction that were much like that of Datto's, and that is shown as in our implications. This ability to replicate a demonstration of significant relationships between these variables is particularly interesting considering the context of COVID-19 related challenges just in the past 2 years. When beginning our research, we were, and still are right now, in the middle of a pandemic world. We questioned if COVID would have an effect on our participants' grit and life satisfaction score compared to others in other studies. But we found that the idea of previous studies continue to be upheld in our research and our sample in the environment of a pandemic world. While the pandemic was not a limitation for us, we did see some other limitations in our research. One being the generalizability of our research to different populations, as our study population was strained by the lack of diversity in ethnicity and age reflective of diverse populations. Future studies can address more representative samples. Another limitation was time constraints. Our research was a one-time evaluation. For future research, we believe it could be done in a longitudinal study and have multiple data collection points in order to observe any fluctuations and or developmental changes in these scores. In terms of future research, we also believe that we could expand the idea of a longitudinal study and examine different stages of life. This would allow us to see if an individual's age affects their life satisfaction and grit scores alone, or the relationship between the two, doing both of those. Within the field, continued research is also needed to further explore the structure of grit in terms of the 2-factor versus the 3-factor model. Empirical clarifications of which structure most effectively reflects the concept of grit will be critical in determining whether the concept continues to play an important role within the research literature or if it will fade away as just like a short-term fad of the psychology field. I do have a few thank yous to say, as many individuals helped me throughout my honors research and this entire experience. First of all, I want to say thank you to Dr. Burns, as she helped me to analyze data and work with SPSS, along with the entire psych department, as all of them helped to coordinate honors research, listen and accept my proposal, and always encourage and lend a helping hand wherever I needed. Thank you for listening to my presentation. Please let me know if you have any questions. And here are my references. Thank you.